Good day, ENG2D. Today we're going to take a look at Elizabethan drama and Shakespeare's England. So Shakespeare lived at a time of incredible growth and change. The time in history is actually referred to as the Renaissance, which is the 15th and 16th century, often associated with great social change. And we're going to see that. We're going to take a look at that here in the next few details. Renaissance, of course, meaning rebirth. And again, we're going to see how this term rebirth really does describe what was happening in England at this time. Not just England, however, but certainly for our purposes, we're going to take a look at the rebirth or the Renaissance period in England. Now, the first thing that we're going to take a look at is how the invention of the printing press in the century before Shakespeare lived, how it had an incredible effect on the growth of the country. Now again, here we see that the printing press was invented by Johann Gutenberg of Germany. 1440, he was starting to do some taking a look at different inventions, and certainly by 1450, he had invented what is now known as the Gutenberg Press. Now, the thing to note here is that this allowed for the sharing of large amounts of information in huge numbers to the masses. So the fact that this affected the growth of the country is pretty self-evident. Number two, at this time, the greatest amount of pleasure came from live entertainment, as reading, even though this printing press allowed for sharing of books and information in large numbers. At this stage, only the aristocratic could afford this mass-produced information. And so, although it was more readily available to the masses, at this stage, certainly it was only people who had money that could afford to buy the books. So here we have the greatest amount of pleasure came from live entertainment, as reading was only for the aristocratic. Theater, therefore, appealed to both the rich and the poor. And we're going to see how this is evident in the actual structure of the theaters themselves. The theater was constructed in such a way that it appealed to different classes. So, for example, in the open pit area, there was no seating, and the groundlings or the peasants were able to watch theater shows from that area. Typically, it would cost about 1 penny to come and see a live performance. The next set of seating that was available was to people who could afford to be seated in the galleries. That would often cost about 2 pennies. And then we had the exclusive gentlemen's seats that would cost about 3 pennies. And the gentlemen here would have exclusive views of the stage and would get a pillow for their tushies. All right. 3, religion. There was a lot of change going on as well as far as religion goes. By the time Queen Elizabeth came to power in 1558, she was Protestant or Anglican, and she was actually the head of this church, the Church of England. Now, when she died in 1603, James I of Scotland actually took the throne. He was James, the King of Scotland, and he was also the only living relative of Queen Elizabeth. She didn't have any children. So he was also the King of England at the time. So he actually held the position of King of Ireland as well. So he was actually for a time held this position of king in 3 different countries. So he was baptized Roman Catholic, and by the time he came to rule, though, he was leaning towards Anglican as well. Now, this was important to note because if you were living at this particular time and you did not adhere to the official religion at the time, you could be considered a heretic and even put to death for it. And the last thing here that we're going to take a look at that influenced this incredible growth and change was the end of the wars with the Spanish Armada. So England defeated the Spanish in 1588, and this led directly to a new way of life for the Elizabethans. Prior to this time, much of the time was spent preparing for war and creating supplies for war. By the time that this armada is defeated in 1588, people found that they had a lot of free time on their hands, and because they didn't have to be focused on working in factories to create different products for the war. So this new way of life involved a lot of free time, and this directly led to an increase in the arts, or interest in the arts. Certainly things like painting. People had the free time now to paint or to write. And we see that this was definitely the case here with Shakespeare. He found the time to do a lot of writing. And so to recap here, all in all, 1590 and 1601 were challenging times for the English people. Writers of the period often reflect on the disillusionment and the sadness of the past. So certainly, in the years following this defeat of the Spanish Armada, a lot of writing did reflect on how sad and how distraught living through this period was, right? Because people would have lost loved ones and had new understandings of how very often in war there isn't a clear winner, right? Okay, let's take a look here at the Elizabethan Playhouse itself. So talking about the structure, the actual theater itself. So the timeline here, taking a look at where did the idea come from to create a building where you could host live theater. So the Playhouse developed from medieval inns with its rooms grouped around a courtyard into which a stage was built. So let's take a look at my very artistic depiction here. Here's an inn, which is like the forerunner of our motels, and very often you would have a courtyard in the middle. Now we're lucky in that here at Hammarskjöld we have a very similar structure, right? We have certainly classrooms that are arranged around a courtyard. Now, in this courtyard is where entertainment would happen within this inn. At the end of one of the courtyards would be built a very crude stage, and the patrons of this inn would be provided chairs to sit on where they could watch these performances. Now, often there was like a house band that would play, or a house group of people who were associated with certain inns. Okay, so this was the pattern evident in the very first theater built in London called The Theatre, and again built by this guy James Burbage. It had a square frame, later either round or octagonal, with a square yard, and this is octagonal was the shape of Shakespeare's theater, later on called the Globe. So let's take a look here. All right, so there were 3 tiers of galleries or levels, each jutting out over the one below. If you've ever gone to a live performance at our auditorium, you know what this situation is like, where one level kind of juts out a little bit further over the other one. The stage extended into the middle of the yard. Now this is different from our experience, of course. If you've gone to the auditorium, there is a stage, of course, right here. But at this time, there was a jutting out piece of stage that would allow for the patrons or the groundlings to circle, or to be centered around this jutting out piece of stage. And that allowed for very close contact with the audience. Now, this worked against the actors as well, because of course these groundlings, if they were dissatisfied, would often throw things like rotten fruit. There was no cover over the yard or stage. and therefore all the lighting was natural. So these performances would take place during the day, right? If there was rain, then obviously no performance could take place. By 1577, we see a crop of other theaters showing up. So 1577, the Curtain is built, 1587, the Rose, 1595, the Swan, and then by 1599, we have the Globe being built, which is Shakespeare's Playhouse. And it was not far from the Rose here on Bankside, meaning on the side, just right close to the River Thames. Now, the Globe had no real scenery, only a few minor props. It was very sparse as far as props were concerned. Therefore, the lines in the play had to reveal things like location, where things were happening, movement of the characters, where they were going. Maybe a character would leave to go to France, and again, that would have to be revealed through the language, and changes in time and place. So, the next day or even morning. Let's take a look here at an example from Hamlet. But look, the morn in russet mantle clad. So again, here we see that the language, the actual line, reveals the setting, reveals to the audience that it is morning. Morning is breaking beyond that hill in the east, turning the sky red. So setting, most of it, as I just said, was created through words. And we know that setting always includes two things: the time, so when things were happening, for example, like the morning, and where things were happening. So the actual location would be mentioned in the lines as well. At this time, the average life of a play was about 10 performances. So 10 performances was just about enough time to allow for all of the people who wanted to go see the play in this London area. That allowed for all of them to be able to go ahead and see that play. All right, let's take a look at the actual design of the playhouse itself. On either side of the stage were doors. And these doors often symbolized countries like France and, England. And so if a character went off to the right-hand side, the audience would know that symbolically meant they were leaving to go to France, things like that. Within the flooring were trap doors for entrances of ghosts, etc., with smoke. Behind the stage, the main stage, was the inner stage, or called the recess, which is where the indoor scenes were played. Some props were used, and when they weren't, they were concealed by the curtain when not in use. All right, let's take a look here. Let's keep going. The actual Elizabethan actors. So each company had a fellowship of about 10 to 15 sharers. So actors, or sometimes they were referred to as shadows as well. With about 10 extras, just in case, they needed some extras or if somebody got sick. 3 or 4, it also included 3 or 4 boys, because at this time, of course, women weren't allowed to play. It was not considered correct or respectful. And so they would have 3 or 4 boys whose voices hadn't yet cracked, and these boys would then play women. The approach to note was different from ours today. So by that I mean the play itself came second and the actors first, as the part was suited to fit the actor. And again, this is different from what we experience today, right? Our actors manipulate how they perform to match a particular character. And at this time, the writer of the play would write particular lines or particular characters to match the people in the fellowship. So it was kind of the opposite of what we experience today. A history of drama. English drama goes back to native forms developed from playlets, presented at church holidays. There were 3 types of church plays that were developed. The very first type was a type called mystery plays. And these plays dealt with biblical stories like the Nativity, which is, of course, the birth of Christ for Christians. The second type here were miracle plays, and they depicted the lives of saints. Now note, the merchant and the craft guilds that came to own and produce the cycles of plays were the forerunners of theatrical companies of Shakespeare's day. The point here that is important to note as well is that these merchant and craft guilds were actually the tradesmen of society. So tradespeople. At this time, the tradespeople were wealthy, very, very wealthy. And they were, they had the money to support things like theatrical companies. Now, both mystery plays and miracle plays were either, one, performed as moving pageants in the street, much like a parade depicting a story as it kind of meandered through main streets. I have a girlfriend that went to Italy. This was just a few years ago, and she was lucky enough to actually watch one of these moving pageants in the streets. Very, very entertaining. Or they were produced as staged shows in a churchyard. Very crude with no real stage. Sometimes a very crude stage, but most of the time, no real stage at all. And then the last type to develop was something called morality plays. And we see this in most of even the films that we go to see, right? An allegory of spiritual conflict between good and evil, right? In the soul of man. And again, as I said, we see this evident in the writing and the films and even live performances that we see today, right? Like, Batman, there's good and evil throughout. So an allegory, again, is a story that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, usually some kind of moral message or even a political one. So, for example, the little, novel or novelette, Animal Farm by George Orwell, is a political allegory, making a comment on inequalities in our political system. All right, let's take a look at Shakespeare's artistry. His plots, the plots in most of his plays, generally had at least two plots, sometimes more. So there was a main plot that was happening and then a subplot. Now, for most of you, you took Midsummer Night's Dream last year, and we see this frame kind of a situation called a frame story, which is also referred to as a story within a story. So we have the main plot here occurring as the frame, and for last year that would have been the wedding of Duke Theseus to Queen Hippolyta. So the main plot of the wedding frames the subplot of the four lovers and also the tradesmen, right? So sometimes more than two stories or two plots happening at the same time. The subplot always reflected the main plot and was often concerned with minor characters. Now, for Shakespeare, part of the genius of his artistry, of course, is how artistically and with such genius level he weaves all of these different subplots together so believably and effortlessly. All right, sources. The plots of Elizabethan plays were usually adapted from other sources. And again, this is kind of counter to what we see in our society today. Originality back then was not in demand. So you could evaluate a playwright's worth by seeing what he did with a familiar tale. So, for example, the story of Romeo and Juliet was an already existing story that already had many different versions of it existing, and we see that Shakespeare took that existing storyline and manipulated it and added some characters and put his own little twists and turns in there. Originality, of course, was not what was in demand. It's what you did with an existing storyline and the creativity that you infused in it that defined a playwright's worth. Yeah. Verse and prose. So again, verse meaning poetry and prose meaning everyday language. So within the plays here that Shakespeare wrote, there was different levels of language. So we see a mixture of both verse and prose was used, and it was often used for character delineation. So verse or poetry rhymed, sometimes rhymed and sometimes not rhymed, but often with a clear meter to it. The aristocratic people or royalty would talk in verse, and it would help to delineate those characters. And commoners, of course, would just use everyday language. So verse used by high-rank speeches, or used in high-rank speeches and important ideas, to highlight important ideas. Again, often said by the aristocracy or royalty. Broken English or prose used for comedic purposes. And very often there was like a fool that would talk in broken English, and just regular old prose was used to give some mundane information, or to create some give information for the rapid scenes. Now for Shakespeare, the poetry that was used, or the verse, was almost always in something known as blank verse. Now this is a type of poetry written in a regular meter that does not rhyme, most commonly found in the form of something called iambic pentameter. So penta here meaning 5. So we have 5 sets of 2 beats, and iambic meaning unstressed stress. So let's take a look at an example here of iambic pentameter. So again, this is taken from Hamlet. To be or not to be, that is the question. So we see that we have 2 beats here, a couplet, so 5 little couplets here, and each of them are unstressed, to be or not to be. So again, so we see this pattern throughout the writing of Shakespeare, and again called iambic pentameter. Lastly here, we'll take a look at how Shakespeare's plays may be divided into 3 very, very, very general categories. So firstly, history plays lent to both tragedy or comedy, and they were often altered for dramatic purposes. They chronicled some person of royal background, usually an important leader that has some kind of a downfall because of an error in his thinking. Some people call this a tragic flaw. And again, taken from real historical figures, usually, royalty. Next, we have tragedy. So for example, Macbeth, the full title, of course, The Tragedy of Macbeth. And this is the play that we're going to take a look at this year, shortly. And then, of course, comedy. And for most of you, you studied A Midsummer Night's Dream last year. And for Shakespeare, his plays that were categorized as comedies often focused on the foibles of humankind. So the human condition, right? What it means to be human under certain circumstances, and how silly it is to be human. And again, if you remember last year, Midsummer Night's Dream, focusing on how silly humans are when they are in love. All right, so that will wrap up our lesson here on Elizabethan drama and Shakespeare's England. Please make sure that you include the annotations for further studying. Thank you kindly.